Hello, and welcome to the Daily Rings of Power podcast, your daily dose of the latest news, rumours, and speculation about the Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power. The day is Monday, August 15th, and I'm your host, Harry. I hope you're having a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. We're back after taking the weekend off, and that means we have plenty to talk about. At the end of last week, we received a couple of pieces of promotional material in the form of a new 30-second teaser and an article with production designer Ramsey Avery on the design of Numenor. We'll briefly cover those at the top of the show, and then we're going to talk about a character that is very dear to me, and that I think has a very interesting arc in the show, Elrond. This isn't going to be a deep dive on the character, but more of a primer episode to get us all thinking about the role of Elrond, his purpose in the story, and why I'm so excited to see Robert Aramayo's portrayal on screen. But first, what better way to start off our week than with a reading from the Professor's work? Today, our reading comes from The Hobbit, Chapter 3, A Short Rest. The master of the house was an elf friend, one of those people whose fathers came into the strange stories before the beginning of history, the wars of the evil goblins and the elves and the first men in the north. In those days of our tale, there were still some people who had both elves and heroes of the north for ancestors, and Elrond, the master of the house, was their chief. He was as noble and as fair in face as an elf lord, as strong as a warrior, as wise as a wizard, as venerable as a king of dwarves, and as kind as summer. He comes into many tales, but his part in the story of Bilbo's great adventure is only a small one, though important, as you will see, if we ever get to the end of it. His house was perfect. Whether you liked food, or sleep, or work, or storytelling, or singing, or just sitting and thinking best, or a pleasant mixture of them all. Evil things did not come into that valley. Well, there's no need to guess why I chose today's quote, but I've always found it interesting that Tolkien described Elrond as such a mixture of character archetypes, and as we'll get into in today's episode, I want to explore the idea of Elrond as a hero without a heroic journey. As I said, we're briefly going to cover the new teaser and article before getting into that discussion. The teaser is mostly material we've seen before, but there are two elements I want to highlight. The first is a line delivered by Galadriel, where she says, "Sometimes to find the light, we must first touch the darkness." Now, many of you will recognise this as a line that the showrunners have been echoing since Comic-Con, and it is clearly one of the key thematic beats they want to hit, this idea that in order to preserve peace and happiness does not come without a struggle with evil and conflict. However, it was also pointed out to me on Twitter by user Brian Donovan that it echoes a line from Unfinished Tales in the story of Tuor and his coming to Gondolin, where the character of Gelmir says, "Through darkness, one may come to the light." It's lovely to see the writers echoing Tolkien's wider writings, even where they cannot replicate the exact dialogue. The second part involves a quartet of quick shots involving the Harfoots. These show the stranger looking concerned, Sadok Burrows and other Harfoots looking shocked, whilst Nori pleads, "He is special, I can feel it." And finally, we see the stranger collapsing to his knees in front of Nori. Now, I'm going to be doing a larger episode on the Harfoots and the stranger and their storyline in the coming days, but I do think this is an interesting clip. It both suggests that the stranger may not only be a danger to himself, but to others as well, whilst also showing what I think will be at the core of this storyline, the enduring Tolkienian message of the courage and kindness of hobbits. I won't cover the Numenor production design article in detail here, as we did a deep dive on Numenor last week, but I will say that these new shots of Armenelos, the capital, look absolutely gorgeous. They're also doing a wonderful job of visual storytelling by having older elven architecture being overwhelmed and replaced by newer mannish architecture. We know the show is up against the challenge of time compression, but a fantastic way to show the political and ideological struggle in Numenor is by showing how the very landscape of the city itself is changing and at conflict with itself. Now, on to our favourite half-elven orphan, Elrond, I was prompted to focus on his character this episode after we got a wonderful new interview with Robert Aramayo on Looper by longtime community member Jaron Pack. Thank you to Jaron for conducting such an insightful interview where you can really see the benefits of an interviewer understanding Tolkien's lore. Before we get into the quotes and key insights from the interview, I wanted to give a very brief explainer of Elrond's backstory for those listeners who are maybe not as familiar with the First Age. By the time we see Elrond in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, he is the wise lawmaster of Rivendell, and arguably the greatest living elven lord alongside Galadriel. But in many ways his background is even more unique than his future. Elrond is called half-elven, but he is so much more than that. He's descended from all three houses of the first men, the Edain. He's descended from all three of the peoples of the Eldar, the Vanyar, the Teleri, and of course the Noldor. And he's even descended from one of the angelic beings, the Maiar, through his great-great-grandmother Melian. He's the descendant of Beren and Luthien, and if that wasn't enough, his own parents were Eärendil and Elwing, the former of whom is arguably the saviour of Middle-earth, after he journeyed to Valinor and beseeched the Valar to finally wage war and defeat Morgoth. All of this is to say that if he then went on to live a quiet, happy life, his very ancestry would be an enormous burden to bear. As Aramayo himself says in the interview, "I feel like when you've come from your dad and your mum saved the world, and your brother created one of the greatest nations that's ever existed, and then here you are, the Herald of Gil-galad. It's a lot to live up to." But unfortunately for poor Elrond, his childhood was not to be a safe and happy one, and his early years carried on as follows. He and his twin brother Elros were captured as a child by Maglor and Maithros, the sons of Feanor, who also drove his mother into the sea, and were it not for the intervention of the Valar, she would have certainly died. And while Tolkien tells us that love grew between them, neither of these adoptive parents would have a happy ending, nor would they survive the end of the First Age. And I know I've been going on for a while, but we then must consider that his own father and mother, despite being key to saving Middle-earth, do not get to reunite with their children. Eärendil literally ascends to the sky and becomes a star, while his mother flies alongside him as a giant bird. Which, I have to admit, does lead to the oft-repeated and always funny joke you hear on Tolkien Twitter, that Elrond introduces himself to everyone by saying, "My dad's a star and my mum's a bird?" To bring us back to where we began, in a final blow to any hopes of Elrond having a happy family in the Second Age, when he and his brother are given the choice to be counted among elves or men, his brother chooses the latter and forsakes his mortality, going on to found the kingdom of Numenor. In other words, by the time we meet Elrond in this show, he is motherless, fatherless, brotherless. He has no title to inherit, no ancestral land of his own, and as a half-elf, he is simultaneously both unique and completely alone in his identity. As you can probably tell, this whole idea of a conflicted identity is what draws me to this character so much. All of this brings us to Robert Aramayo's portrayal of the character. As he says in his latest interview, he's closer to being an orphan than he is to being a lord, but he's trying so hard to be the Herald of Gil-galad. This idea of his identity being interlinked with his orphan status is something that fascinates me about the character, because it's not just about a lack of family, it's the removal of identity and purpose. Aramayo goes on to say, right now he's still unresolved with his dad and his mum and his past and his brother. Now this is something I hope the show explores, in particular with his brother. For Tolkien, Elros has one narrative purpose: to be the one to found Numenor, and through his lineage, create the internal struggle at the heart of this kingdom, between the fidelity to the elves and their own mannish mortality. But what we never hear from Tolkien is how Elrond felt about Elros's choice. Did he resent his brother for leaving him? Did he admire Elros for taking up the legacy of the Edain and guiding this nascent kingdom? Of interest to me, did Elrond visit Elros in Numenor, and was he there when his brother finally died? All of these questions and their answers would have fascinating implications for the relationship between elves and Numenor that the show is going to have to depict. Where exactly does Elrond sit on that issue? Then we must consider his relationship to the other great elves of the Second Age. Let's tackle Galadriel because it's the one I'm most interested in. While Elrond will eventually go on to be Galadriel's near equal, and will actually marry her daughter, Aramayo gives us this insight on where they are at the start of the show. It's clear that she's been in my life for quite a long time, and he admires her greatly. She's a legend already to him, and so he admires her. And that's where he finds that first difficult decision he has to make, of friendship and duty, honouring his friendship and his admiration for her, but at the same time honouring the will of his king. Now, when we first saw the dialogue between Galadriel and Elrond discussing who had seen what in that teaser trailer, a lot of people read that as Galadriel talking down to Elrond. But I think it's something much deeper, a dichotomy in the way these two view the world. Elrond has lost everyone in his life, and he believes that if Galadriel keeps seeking evil to fight, he may lose her as well. Meanwhile, Galadriel believes that if the elves are complacent to evil, then everybody is doomed. And for her, this is only reinforced by having lost the majority of her family in the wars of the First Age. I'm so excited to see where this relationship between the two goes. For me, it's fundamental to the themes and ideas this show is exploring. Then, when it comes to Gil-galad, we must once again consider the narrative role of characters in Tolkien's writings. Gil-galad's purpose is solely to be the High King in the Second Age, to recognise the growing threat, form the last alliance, and die defeating Sauron. However, his relationship to Elrond is complex. He is his lord and king, yes, but he's also a mentor, and perhaps even a surrogate father figure in his own way. As Aramayo says, "He's my king. I'm serving him, he's telling me where to go and what to do, but also, it's a bit of a mentorship as well. If you look at the great achievements of Gil-galad, there are reflections of them in some of the deeds of Elrond." The show has lots of room to explore how Elrond steps out of Gil-galad's shadow and becomes the Lord of Imladris. But first we must see how he gets to this position. We must see how Elrond goes from the herald to a lord in his own right to one of the most important elves to ever exist. Which leads me to my final point, and where I'll be finishing today's episode. Elrond in the Second Age is in many ways not a classical hero. He's the right hand to the heroic king, and while he is one of the elves who does not trust Anatar, his greatest achievement is creating a safe haven for elves during the war, which fans will be familiar with as Imladris or Rivendell. But it is important to remember that he is not the heroic protagonist of the Second Age. To me, Elrond is the character who is the descendant of the great heroes of the First Age, but he does not have a traditional heroic purpose or destiny. He lives among the elves and is counted among them, but as Aramayo says, that doesn't mean he's one of them, and it doesn't mean he's the same as the rest of them. Of course, Elrond will be a decisive figure in the Third Age, and he will do great deeds in the Second Age, but that age is not the story of Elrond as the hero or saviour of Middle-earth. It's the story of an individual burdened with probably the greatest family legacy of Middle-earth, and yet he has to forge a future largely on his own terms. It's for this reason that I think his journey is one of the most interesting we're going to see, and why I can't wait to see what a talented actor like Robert Aramayo does with this freedom of interpretation. Now, I didn't even have time to talk about his relationship to Celebrimbor, the dwarves, or even his future wife and daughter. Nor did I get time to rave about the fact that Aramayo appears to be taking on the identity of Lawmaster quite literally, and his knowledge of Tolkien has blown me away. But to be honest with you, I could just talk about Elrond for hours, and I'm sure over the coming weeks and months we'll have time to do just that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what aspect of Elrond's character or story you're most interested in seeing. Would you like to see a flashback to Elrond and Elros seeing each other for the last time? How would you portray his complicated relationship to Celebrimbor as a descendant of the Sons of Feanor? So if you'd like to continue the conversation, please leave a comment on Twitter. As always, I'd greatly appreciate if you could leave a rating or review on whichever podcast platform you use. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening. I'll be back tomorrow with more discussion of the latest news on the Daily Rings of Power podcast. Namari.